Well, good Saturday afternoon. Hope that you're having a great day today. Out walking here in Eatonton, Georgia. It's a little chilly, so got my jacket and my toboggan on. But my name is Jay Thompson. I'm the teaching pastor here at Simply Church, and we are in the beginning stages of a series from now till Easter, as we're going to be looking at the letters from Paul. And we're going to start in 1 Thessalonians. And a couple days ago, I shared kind of an overview of the book that Paul wrote to the church at Thessalonica. And from a chronological standpoint, it's one of the first letters that he wrote. And so today what I wanted to do is I want to dig a little deeper and give kind of a takeaway from 1 Thessalonians, because there's kind of, some big overarching understandings and stuff that we talked about a couple days ago. And I want to drill down on one of those related to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. And in verse 12, Paul is writing, if you remember, he had sent Timothy back and to be the leader there at the church of Thessalonica, and had heard this great report about the church. And he says this, he says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 12, he says, "We pleaded with you, we encouraged you, and we urged you to live your lives in such a way that God would consider worthy. For you are called to share in his kingdom and in his glory." I wrote this down. It says that the follower of Jesus is a life that follows the path laid out for us. That's what it means to be a follower. The life of a follower of Jesus is about following the path, the life that God has laid out for us. Now, what happens is this, a couple things I want to think about. What happens when we get off of that path that God has laid out for us? What happens when we begin to step out of his will for our life and start stepping into our own will, our own desires, this is what I want in my life. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves in some places that we were never intended to be, seeing some things we were never intended to see, saying some things that we never really intended to say, and ultimately doing some things that God never really intended for us to do. And we find ourselves not living a life that's worthy, not, following the path that God has laid out for us. How do we respond in those moments? Well, I think a lot of times what we do is that we immediately jump to making excuses. And we make that excuse, well, God, this is so hard. Or God, this is not what I wanted. Or God, such and such did not get to come along with me in this journey. And we come up with all of these excuses. It's too hard. It's too long. It's too difficult. And we get all of these excuses. Now, if you've heard about excuses is like everybody has them. They're like armpits, right? Everybody has them and they all stink. Well, that's kind of what happens is when we really look at those excuses, is the excuses not because God is limited. The excuses we come up with reflect the limiting ways that we look at ourselves and being willing to follow after God. The other thing I thought about was this, is that when we get off the path that God has intended for us, we oftentimes then begin to justify our actions. We justify those wrong things. We go, well, God, I deserve this. Or God, this happened, so I did this. And we come up with all of these justifications and play that whole rationalization game of, I deserve this, or it should have been better, and all of that. When we get to those moments in our life, when we find ourselves trying to justify wrong things to a holy God, that it's time for us to step back and evaluate, are we on the right path? But I think one of the things, too, we do very quickly when we find ourselves off the path that God's intended for us is we blame everybody else. We go, well, if they'd have treated me better, or if somebody had taught me more, or if somebody had been a better example, or I'm where I'm at now because my leader has, taken a wrong path, and we begin to blame everybody else for our actions, where Paul says this, I want you to live a life worthy of God's call in your life. I think the best way for us to respond when we get off the path is to know what? Evaluate. I wrote this down. And then get back on track. Get back on track. I think one of the greatest lies of the devil is that when we get off the path that God has for us, the devil wants us to think that we can never get back on God's path. We're never good enough. We never deserve it. Can I help you understand something? We are never good enough. And we do not deserve what God has done for us. But he does desire for us to step back into following his path and his will for our life. And what that looks like is this, is us stepping back and going, okay, God, I agree with the things that I've been doing. They've not been your will in my life, not been following those. And God, I'm going to turn back. I'm going to get back on track. And that's what it looks like. Paul he uses 3 words here in the New Living Translation. He says, I plead with you, I urge you, and I encourage you to get back on track. To make sure you stay living your life that God would look at as a life that is worthy. Now again, we live our lives worthy, not for God's approval. We live our lives because we have been approved by God. Our approval doesn't come because of who we are. Our approval comes because of our acceptance of Jesus Christ and what he has done for us. So Paul says this, he says, I plead with you. He's calling us to his side, saying, come and follow after the Lord like I am. He encourages us. He wants to do whatever it takes to admonish us and to motivate us to live that worthy life. And then lastly, it says that he urges us. He's like a witness, somebody who has been down the road before, and he has given us, look, I know what lies ahead. Stay on the path that God has for you. So what does that look like? What does that look like to live a life that is worthy? Interesting enough, here in 2 Thessalonians, Paul answers that in the 2 verses previous, in verses 9 and verses 10 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. And so just a couple things. What does that look like to live a life worthy? Is that we work hard with the opportunities that God opens up for us. It's exactly what Paul said in verse 9. He says, man, we work diligently. We work hard at everything that God has provided. And I think that's really is what's going to keep us living and walking on the path that God has for us, is that we are willing to take advantage and step forward and work hard in the opportunities that God gives us. Too often we spend a lot of time going, God, I want this opportunity, and we're missing the things that he already has open for us in our life. And then in verse 9 too, he says this, you do that because you don't want to be a burden on other people. That word burden there means to literally load down with a heavy weight or a heavy load. If we are so burdensome to people and we load them down with who we are in our life, we really minimize the amount of opportunity that somebody has to know Jesus as their Lord and Savior, because we are so weight them down with ourselves. We need to not be a burden so that we leave room for us in our lives as we work hard, as we connect with other people, so that we can share with them and they're not so burdened by us that they see their own burden, their own need, if you will, for the Lord, and we have the chance to share with them. And then in verse 10, he uses 3 words to describe how Paul and the leadership team that traveled around with him on these missionary trips, he said this, he said, we are devoted, we are honest, and we are faultless. Now, what Paul is not saying is this. He's not saying I'm perfect, but he's saying we follow an example. First Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, he says, follow me as I follow after Jesus. Who is Jesus? He was devoted, he was honest, he was faithful, he was faultless. What does that mean for me and you to live that life, to stay on the path? Is that we know what we believe, what we say, and what we do. What we believe, what we say, and what we do, they all match. We don't just say one thing and live another. We don't proclaim a belief that we hold dear and not share that and live that out before other people. What we believe in God, what we say about God, we live out in our life in obedience and trust of God. So today I think I would lead myself with this question. Am I on the path God has for me? If I'm finding myself off that path, if I know Jesus is my Lord and Savior and I'm not following the path that He has for me, it's time for me to do a little evaluation. Am I devoted? Am I honest? And am I faultless? Are my beliefs, my words, and my actions lining up? And if they're not, then I'm God to change His standard. I need to step back and begin to change my life to match the standard that God has laid out for me. So I hope those words have encouraged you today as we look at this book of 1 Thessalonians. Wrestle with that question today for yourself. Are you on the path that God has for you? If you're not sure what that even looks like, I'd love to connect with you. Go to our website at simplychurch.online, scroll down to the bottom, fill out the connect card, hit submit. I'd love to talk with you about questions that you have, maybe prayer requests that you have, and just have a chance to connect with you. Hope you have a great Saturday, and I hope you spend some time evaluating the path that you're on and make sure it's the one that God intends for you. Talk to you later.